But I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Dr. Alan Mendoza, who is the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, thank you for joining me at this very important debate and an important day, I think, the fallout of this. Have you been surprised by the abuse and the vitriol that the Home Secretary has received following that speech yesterday?
No, not in the slightest, because every time this argument is made, the sort of manifestly obvious point that multiculturalism is indeed not something that ought to be embraced, but indeed turned on its head. Every time that comes up, of course, there's a cavalcade of problems and abuse and hysteria around it. But, you know, what your segment just a moment ago showed was very interesting. We've had years of this, and yet it's very interesting that when she says it, there's a particular attack.
This is a key point. I don't remember Tony Blair or David Cameron or Louise Casey getting a whole pile on in the same way that this Home Secretary has. Is that because of the small boats problem, or is it because the Tories are under pressure? What's your view on that? It feels very different.
No, do you know, I'd go a little bit further than that. I'd say it's because Suella Braverman is an example of what integration really looks like. And not, as was said by another commentator today, that she's an example of multiculturalism. No, on the contrary, she is an example of integration. Yes, she's got her own identity, but she has embraced the British identity with it as well. And the point is that because she is so manifestly and obviously, if you like, someone who ought, in the view of the left, to be defending multiculturalism, and yet here she is attacking it, that, you know, marks her out for special attention.
OK, but you've hit possibly the nail on the head. Have we got the terminology completely wrong here? Is multiculturalism actually the wrong word to use? And actually, what we've got, very successfully, is a multi-ethnic society focused around one British culture. That culture of fairness, of decency, of tolerance, of respect, whether it's from Shakespeare to cricket to Churchill to James Bond. These are the great things that we love and take huge pride in our history. Maybe actually that is the right way to be looking at it. We're multi-ethnic and we've been, I would say, possibly the most successful in the Western world at that over many, many decades. And we should celebrate that. And that this idea that sort of multiculturalism, in a sense, if you've got different cultures staying on different railway tracks and never the twain shall meet, never the tracks shall meet, then actually that's what creates the problems. And if you've got communities from one group, one culture, staying in one area and not integrating, that's where problems arrive.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is the whole point. Now, the terminology is correct in the sense because if you recall, that Labour government, the 97 Labour government, decided to bring in, if you like, this idea that come here, you don't need to integrate. I mean, Blair subsequently discovered the problems of that, obviously. Do your own thing and it won't be an issue. And of course, it turned out to be an immediate issue, an immediate problem. And so since then, we've been wrestling with this idea of the vision you've suggested, which is the right vision for this country, which is doesn't matter where you're from, historically, where, you know, what your background is, what your religion is. What matters is, are you prepared to buy into what this society is offering, to buy into the values this society believes in, and to be a part of that, maintaining your own identity, that's fine. But you've got to be part of the broader whole and accept that when there's a conflict between, if you like, the mores of the old world, the values of the old world, and those of the new that you're in, that you buy into that new world side over the old.
And I've done it myself, actually, because I lived a couple of years in France and I bought into the wonderful French culture. The cheese, the wine, the long lunches. I mean, there was huge things to embrace in the French culture, which when I came back to the UK, many of those things had sort of disappeared. The long lunch had long gone. So I think, actually, that is it. When you go to live and enjoy and stay in a different country, you've actually got to embrace that local culture. And that's what we should be saying to those who come to live in the UK. We are one fantastic British culture. Embrace it, enjoy it, use it, infuse it, rather than say, no, I'm a separate culture on a separate railway track and I'm not going to mix and not integrate. There is the road to ruin, as our leaders have previously said well over a decade.
Well, you're quite right, but here's the interesting point. So this debate has gone on, as you said, for over a decade. We've seen the conversations. What we've been seeing a lack of, though, is action to make it happen. So time and time again, people say there's a problem here, we've got to do better, but then there's a lack of how to deal with it. And you highlighted, for example, the Casey review, Baroness Casey, the point she put forward. Now, why is it the case that 7 years after that review has come out, we still have not implemented what she suggested were remedies to stop that division, to stop that sort of artificial barriers between people? We need the government to get up and go beyond words now and to take those recommendations.
But do you think the government's capable of that? The Home Secretary has made a strong speech, but will there be any backup? The United Nations has already basically completely rejected the idea that a dusty, archaic, old 70-year document should be amended and updated. Does that tell you something about them or something about our Home Secretary?
Well, the UN's never going to do anything. I mean, it's always the product of the lowest common denominator, and you can't get change there. You have to have leaders who are willing to stand up, to be counted, and to show they're serious. So if she's serious about this, she can come home from her trip and she can start implementing those review procedures to say, this is my words now turning into action.